Welcome to the conference, Perpetrator Work during COVID-19 with critical aspects and new challenges. My name is Dejan Edukovic and I'm the chair of the board of the organization WWP. Let me give you just a little background on the European Network for Work with Perpetrators of Domestic Violence. It was formally founded in 2014, but we started working together some years before. Now it includes 62 members from 32 countries, and the members are organizations who work with perpetrators or work with victims or do research on domestic violence. Now, the mission of the network is to address violence in close relationships as a gender-based phenomenon, to foster gender equality and improve the safety of those at risk from violence in close relationships. We have prepared an exciting program. So this is the preview that you can see on your screens. After this welcome, and we will have the first keynote by Alessandra, the executive director of WWP. And that will be followed by a short break of only 10 minutes. But then we will have a panel discussion at 9:40. And I invite you to be back on time so that you don't miss anything from this exciting discussion. This will be followed by a question and answer session, and you will have the opportunity to ask the questions in the chat box, but we'll come back to that a little bit later. Then we will have a break, after which at 11:30, there will be two parallel workshops that you can probably have seen in the program that you looked at before the conference. That will be followed by a lunch break, and then again, two parallel workshops, and then we will go to the closing. However, the closing will not be definite for some of you who would like to stay in the room and then do the social networking. Here are some information about technical and housekeeping information. Now, to move around the conference, you will see that below the video, there are the three buttons that you can use to move around the conference. You are currently in room 1, but then and you will stay in this room during the panel discussion. And after the break, if you want to stay in the workshop A and C, you stay in the room 1. If you choose workshop B and D, you should go to room number 2. Now there is a button with the delegate bag, and there are some things that we have prepared for you. First of all, there is a PDF of the program. Then there are certificates of attendance of this mini conference, and also the document that WWP has prepared about how to do perpetrator work under the conditions of COVID-19, lockdown, and increased risk for the victims of domestic violence. The virtual social networking later on at the end of the conference is also going to happen in room 1 or 2, so you can choose that. As I said, you can use the chat box to ask the questions and pose any of the comments. Please enter your name and then you can participate. We will welcome also the first chats, like telling us how you are, where you come from, and any comments besides asking the questions. We will collect the questions also during the panel discussion, and as I will be facilitating the panel discussion, we will try to put together the similar questions and ask the panelists to respond to them. Now, we hope there will be no technical difficulties, but we live in such an unpredictable world that this can happen even during this conference. The first thing that you can do is to refresh the browser and try to connect from another device. If that doesn't happen, please send the email to our conference support organization, and they'll do whatever they can to help you out. And also, please keep an eye on your emails because there might be some emergency instructions. At this point, I would like to thank everyone who is here today, the speakers and attendees, and I hope that you'll find this time today worthwhile for our joint mission. I want to thank the European Commission and the Hope Foundation for their generous contribution and who helped this conference happen here. Not to forget the support staff who have been working very hard to make this conference run smooth, and we hope that this will actually work out that way. The next is our keynote speech by Alessandra Pauncz. But before she starts, let me remind you that there will be a coffee break at 9:30. It's only 10 minutes coffee break, so you better prepare your coffee ahead of time. And then at 9:40, we'll start the exciting panel discussion. So I invite you to be here back on time. Let me introduce now our keynote speaker, Alessandra Pauncz. She is the Executive Director of WWP European Network and has been working in the field of domestic violence for over 20 years in different capacities. She advocated and worked for victims of domestic violence as a shelter worker and as a psychologist. She was a manager and a trainer at local, national, and European level, introducing very innovative training methods and writing books about the training. She founded and ran the first perpetrator program in Italy, CAM, the well-known Center for Abusive Men, and set up the national Italian network for perpetrator work, the RELIVE. She will give keynote speech in which she will present and discuss the guidelines for perpetrator work during the COVID crisis. So I invite you to listen to Alessandra.
Good morning to everybody. I want to thank Dean for the nice presentation, and we will be briefly discussing now the COVID-19 crisis, what WWP has been doing, and the guidelines that we issued during the pandemic. We are currently living in very challenging and unusual times. No previous experience has really prepared us for what has happened and is happening over the past few months. As we struggle to get our footing, we, as professionals that work with domestic violence, know that we are now facing a double pandemic, the COVID-19 and violence against women. We also know that the lockdown and the subsequent economical crisis has created known risk factors, forced cohabitation, increased family carrying workload with schools closed, economical crisis, losing jobs, uncertainty, fear for the future, and increased anxiety. And over these past few months, we've been hearing a lot about increased violence, and we've been wondering about the data and the information that is out there concerning domestic violence. There is no certain indication of what has been happening with domestic violence. However, we do have some indicators that the violence has increased. The French Interior Minister, Christophe Castaner, said that in France, domestic violence has increased by 30%. Cyprus reports that there's an increase in the police reports of domestic violence. Turkey reported an increase to the helpline request. Brazil, the state hotline increased of 18% of calls in 1 week in March. There also have been different strategies in responses to the crisis. France issued a strategy over mask 19 to the pharmacy to get details directly to the police. The UK had an extension of the 911 by pressing 55 that would get women through directly to the police. There are also some indications in Iraq that there was a rise in the first month of the request to the hotline that then fell afterwards. And the helpline in Italy, the calls were up by 73% between the 1st of March and the 16th of April. However, the reports decreased by 43%. Also, what has been happening in terms of feminicides is not quite clear. It is difficult because there are fluctuations in the number of women that are killed by month, independently from specific factors. We do know that between January and March, 18 women were killed in Spain. From the beginning of the year in Argentina, 86 women were killed, of which 24 during lockdown. In Turkey, 18 women were killed during the lockdown. Israel had 6 cases since January, 3 of which were killed during lockdown. However, in Italy, the number of women decreased. There were 35% of female homicides went down, and 83% drop of women killed by their partners. So also on this, there's still a lot of research that needs to be done. We also have very little evidence of what happened with perpetrator programs. We did a survey among our members. Our Czech members increased 100% increase from perpetrators. Spain also reported more or less 100% increase. Italy had a fall during the quarantine with an increase of 50% in May when the programs opened up again. And Respect Hotline had an increase by 93%. So we have spotty evidence of the violence going up, or anyway, important fluctuations in what was happening. So when we were facing the initial phases of the lockdown with the pandemic, our concern as service providers that are working with domestic violence was obviously the safety of victims. And because we are a perpetrator program network, the question was also, can we, should we, and if we do, how should we reach out to perpetrators to minimize the impact of violence on women and children? And the answer to these questions were, can we? Most perpetrator programs had way of accessing the men, but the real question was, should we, and will it be safe for us to reach out to perpetrators? So we also started by trying to collect some feedback from the victims, from our victim support services. We did a very small sampling on this, but what the women were mostly saying were that it was a relief if there was ongoing contact and support for the perpetrator. They had concerns for the situation of crisis and instability. There were also concerns for the management of children, all the homework and all dealing with these issues became critical aspects with the perpetrator. And they reported increased psychological violence. So given also this feedback and given the situation of perpetrator programs that already had done the risk assessment with perpetrators and already had a number of perpetrators on their program, we decided to go forward and try and look a little bit more at how to reach out in a safe way to perpetrators. This is where we started our work on the guidelines for standards that you find on the website, and I won't go into detail. I'm just going to outline some of the relevant issues that are even more relevant in this phase in which we're going through, and that I think will be relevant for the future of our programs. So the first very relevant aspect is that of having to determine an action plan. So before we could go and reach the perpetrators and decide what kind of support to provide, we had to have a very clear idea of what we were doing, how we were doing it, and what kind of effect on others what we were doing would have. And this required that we analyze the context, because there was a huge difference throughout Europe of the different contexts, the different situations, the different, even regionally, things might change quite a bit. There were different social responses that was also really important to address. What are the services that are available? Was the police responding to calls? Did women's support services have shelters for quarantining women if they had to come away from home? What kind of services were in place? So this was obviously really important to know what kind of intervention would be possible. What were the specific stressors for families? How severe is the lockdown? How many people are still going to their jobs or leaving the house? How accessible is the food supply? What kind of other issues are happening at the time? Let's remember, for example, that Croatia also faced an earthquake and the consequences of the earthquake. So every specific context had to be dealt with a specific plan. And last but not least of the question was, can we use normal perpetrator materials? Can we continue working with perpetrators in the same way as we were doing before? Because at this point, we were actually dealing with two elements. And this, I think, is something that we need to keep in mind even moving forward. One is the specific crisis due to the pandemic. And the other one was that we were doing something that was quite unprecedented in the history of perpetrator programs. That is, that we were passing from in-person services and going completely to distance servicing, be they online or via phone. So that was the two elements that are really relevant of what was happened, and is currently also what we should be reflecting on. So once we determined the action plan, then we had to obviously problem shoot for high risk, obviously prioritizing the safety of those affected by the violence, but also identifying levels of risk. And this, you also find a flow chart that we supported to help programs identify it, because with the lockdown, some of the risk factors were actually shifting and changing somewhat. There is then another really important phase, and I think it's particularly important now. It may seem strange, but even more so now, which is the preparation phase. Why is it so important now? Well, I'm going to anticipate something of the conclusions, because first of all, it's not over. And we need to take advantage of this situation that we have now with the knowledge of what has happened to be prepared. Preparation means that service providers that are working with perpetrators need to have the technological support to be able to go online. They need to be provided with their platforms. We need to have a better idea of how technologically savvy the perpetrators that come to our program are, what their accesses are, and how we can work on them, both in person and distance. We need to probably include in our group work some preparation so that when we and if we need to go online, we are not caught unprepared. And more specifically, we need protocols of intervention with social services and law enforcement for situations of risk and high risk. So, given these first 2 points, the next one was, so should we be using the same programs, or should we have a different way of addressing perpetrators within this critical situation? And our answer was to this was no, we should be working specifically considering that we are in a short-term, high-risk crisis situation. We should respond appropriately with crisis management. What does that mean? That means that the goals of crisis management in this case would be those of reducing risk, decreasing perpetrator stress, increasing the coping mechanisms, mitigating effects of violence on family members, and continuing to reach out and listen to survivors' voices. And the kind of intervention to reach these goals would be focused on providing support, facilitating emotional release, increasing the perpetrator's coping skills. And this also was provided in the guidelines through also practical indications on how to do it, and also the timing, how often, and there's a lot that we could talk about in terms of intervention, and maybe we can do that then in the round table and in the workshops more specifically. There obviously were some ethical concerns that were raised in terms of an intervention that is more leaned on the support side than on challenging behavior. For some, the issue of confronting at all times abusive behavior was really important. But it seemed almost as if support went counterwise of accountability. However, in this particular situation, the priority was minimizing the violence for women and children, and providing this kind of support and intervention seemed like the safest way forward, since we were exactly doing this complete shift in the intervention model, in which many of the service providers were extremely unfamiliar. Of course, we were also giving indications to service providers that they needed to keep a close tab on all the behaviors that were going on, but that certain behaviors may and should have been confronted at a later time when it was a safer environment to do so. So, what now, and how do we move forward? Well, I anticipated my punchline. It's not over. We should prepare for further lockdown because, as we're seeing, as it's happening in different regions of the world, first of all, in certain parts of the world, it's extremely serious and increasing now. It hasn't yet peaked. So some parts of the world are dealing at this time with severe lockdown. But in other cases, we are also seeing rises in certain areas or regions. So we need to be prepared. And then another question that we have is, what should we do with the online counseling or the online groups? I mean, we have experimented with a lot of these online platforms. What do we want to do with that now? Is it something that we should completely dismiss? Should we keep it in the background? Should we be using it alternatively? I think there's a lot of reflection that we need to do in terms of how does it work and how do we want to use it going forward. We also need to use, as I was mentioning before in the preparation, we need to use this time to make protocols for victim safety, protocols with social services, protocols with law enforcement, and protocols with women's support services, so that we are able to respond in a safe way for victims when we are faced with at-risk situations. And basically, there are a series of questions that we have to answer on: do we want to change, and what do we want to change if we do, and what do we need to change, and what do we need to change if we do. And this requires a deeper reflection on how all this has affected our identities, how all this has affected our programs. What do we want to learn and take forward from what has happened? And what do we need to have in place to respond to future crises? So this is my closing, these are my closing questions more than answers, because I think that we're still in the full flow of a process. And I hope that the roundtable and the workshops will help us start to address these questions. Thank you very much for your attention.